Hi, I'm Femi OK. Today on the stream, the founding director of Boston University Center for Anti-Racism Research. And we also have a New York Times best-selling author of How to Be an Antiracist, an Anti-Racist Baby, professor, historian, scholar, also a New York Knicks fan, can't be great at everything, and a girl dad. Dr. Ibram X Kendi, so good to have you here on the stream. Welcome to the show. Lovely to have you here. We're going to be talking about your work, the challenges of spreading anti-racism and the tools you use to do that. And we're going to start with a brand new book called Magnolia Flower, which is a children's book, which says so much, but also tells a beautiful story. How would you describe it?
Well, Femi, thank you so much for having me on. And this is a love story. Magnolia Flower is about an Afro-Indigenous girl in Florida who is prevented from love and finds a way to fall in love and maintain her love. But it's also a story about nature. The love story is told from a mighty river to a dancing brook. And Magnolia's parents, one fled the Trail of Tears when Native people were forced off their land, and another fled slavery. And so there's this historical element as well in this love story.
There's so much in the book if you go a little bit deeper. I remember when I was reading kids' books, and when I reread them as an adult, I realized that there was so much xenophobia and jingoistic behavior that I hadn't noticed as a child, but when I read back as an adult, I was horrified. So what we give our youngsters to read is going to be so formative. So what are the lessons that a little one is not going to notice immediately, but when they grow older, it's going to impact how they see the world?
I think what's striking about Magnolia Flower is this girl grows up in what's called a maroon community. These were communities during the enslavement era where Black and Native people fled slavery or even settler colonialism and formed their own sort of these islands of freedom within this vast sort of seas of slavery. And you would think during these eras of enslavement and settler colonialism that everything was pain and that people did not find love. But what you find in Magnolia Flower is despite the pain and the violence, Magnolia Flower finds love. And it's that love that actually generates the resistance of people to those harmful and oppressive conditions.
I am going to be talking to Dr. Ibram X Kendi about his work, his writing, his approach to anti-racism, and you can be part of that conversation as well. We're on YouTube, we're live right now. The comment section is right here for you to jump into and be part of today's show. I am looking at some of the books that you have written, and for young people, let's start here with Magnolia Flower, but if we go back through some of the other work, Goodnight Racism, How to Raise an Anti-Racist, Stamped for Kids, Racism, Antiracism, and You, and it goes on and on. If you live in America, you will realize that these titles might be triggering for some Americans, and they get upset that with young people and with actually anybody, that there is a way to look at the world that says we can do better. We don't have to behave like this to each other because we look different. How do you cope with that pushback to what you do?
I think, unfortunately, that the pushback is based on an idea that's been disproven. And that idea that I'm talking about is that young kids don't see color, don't see race, aren't thinking better or worse about people because of the color of their skin, that they're innocent in that way. And unfortunately, that's just not true. Scholars have consistently documented all over the world that our kids, as early as 3 and 4 years old, are already attaching behavior to skin color, are already thinking that people have more because they are more. And so what are we doing to counteract those ideas? And that's one of the reasons why I'm specifically writing for children, because I want every child to know that there's nothing right or wrong about them, because of the color of their skin. And if there's inequality, it's not because a particular group is superior or inferior. I want every child to be able to see their skin color as part of the human rainbow and be able to see its beauty just as they see the beauty of humanity.
A little early on, we spoke to Tracy Baxley. She's an author and a professor, and she made a comment about how you make it easier for parents to talk to their children about racism. Here she is.
I believe Dr. Kendi's work has shaped the teaching of our children through the recent movement of parents' willingness to unlearn and relearn. Dr. Kendi's work has inspired parents to be more reflective and thoughtful about their own lived experiences and how those experiences really influence the way that they show up as parents. Many parents are more open to have the hard dialogue about being anti-racist and to have those dialogues with their children, very different from the way that they were raised with their own parents.
Wow, and indeed, that's precisely what I'm seeking and striving to do. And if anything, I'm trying to encourage parents and give them the tools to recognize that just as it's important for us to actively teach our kids to be nice, to share, to actively teach our kids about stranger danger, to actively teach our kids to look both ways before they cross the street, it's also important to teach our kids to be anti-racist, and that it's actually protective for them to know and understand racial equality, so that when ideas try to convince them otherwise, they can say, no, that's wrong. I know we're all equals.
Conversation on YouTube. Let me share what Anna is thinking. And she says it's very naive to think that kids won't reflect their parents' prejudice or their environmental prejudice. What examples have you seen? I know we've all heard little children coming out with things where you think, whoa, we know they heard that from their parents. What have you heard? What have you seen?
Well, I can remember my partner, my wife Sadiqa. She tells a story when she was about 15 years old, and she grew up in Albany, Georgia, in Southwest Georgia, and she was walking along an area looking for her dog, and she looks up at a balcony area and sees a child that's about 2 or 3 years old, and that child is glaring at her, and that child calls her the N-word. And so of course we could all figure out where that child not only heard the word, but heard who to say it to, and not only heard who to say it to, but say it in a mean way. I mean, our children are soaking up what we're doing or saying, and that's why it's important for us to be diligent about how we're modeling, and certainly what we're teaching.
Lucia uses a phrase. Lucia is on YouTube. She's watching us right now. She uses a phrase which has got a lot of debate and discussion around this phrase. But Lucia says, children are colorblind.
Well, unfortunately, scholars have shown that as early as 3 years old, our kids have what one scholar called an adult-like concept of race. Other scholars have found that, for instance, in the United States, kids are attaching, they're attaching sort of darker skin to ugliness, to dishonesty, to other behavioral traits. By 5 years old, even more kids are doing so. So unfortunately, even though we like to think of our kids as colorblind, scholars and scientists have consistently shown that that's just not true.
Yeah, even little brown and black children see brown and black as a bad thing, or hair texture as a bad thing, and they're tiny, little tinies.
Yeah, you have parents of brown and black children who will tell you about that day when their child came home and said, I want to be white, or their child came home and said, I want blue eyes, or their child came home and said, I wish my hair was straighter. That's happening right now. And those kids are 3, 4, 5 years old.
All right, so what do we do about this?
Well, we actually have to counteract these are ideas. Like, I think we've been misled into believing that a racist idea is just too complex
Yeah.
for our kid to understand. But you know, an idea, dark is ugly, that's a very simple idea that even a 2 or 3-year-old can understand. So we have to actively teach our child that dark and light are beautiful. Because unfortunately, they're going to hear a different idea. And we want the first idea that they hear is to be that anti-racist idea.
Donald Earl Collins is a visiting professor at Loyola University, and he talked about the complexity of the societies that we live in, and how do we even tackle that hugeness of racism that surrounds us, not just in the US, but around many parts of the world. This is what he told us earlier.
My question for you today is about how you conceptualize the term racist thought, and how you suggest that since we all have racist thoughts, that we're all complicit somehow, not only in terms of interpersonal, individual racism, but in the systemic racism that has suppressed millions upon millions of people over the last half of a millennia. So how do we fight systemic racism, not just individual racism, but systemic racism, when we're all complicit in something that really has an impact mostly on people who are not white?
That's the very question that I was actually asking myself, and indeed people were asking me, which ultimately led me to really begin to emphasize to people all over the world that we have to think about how we can be anti-racist. What that means is, instead of thinking about, okay, I don't want to be racist, we should start actively thinking about how we can be anti-racist. What I mean by that is, how can we go about internalizing ideas of racial equality? How can we go about recognizing that the racial groups, despite the ways in which they may look different, or even different ethnic groups that are racialized may practice different cultures, how can we see difference as equals? How can we begin to see the problem as bad rules as opposed to bad people? This is taking an affirmative stance to begin to understand and internalize racial equality, and beginning to understand that inequity is the result of structural racism, which then will allow us to focus on eliminating structural racism, as opposed to spending so much time looking down at different groups of people.
Is this an individual way of thinking? Is this how, I set out my day and I approach my day in this way? This is my viewpoint on the world to make sure that I'm being anti-racist? Or is this something that we have to ask of politicians and governments and school bodies?
I actually think it's both. I think if we as individuals are being anti-racist, then we're going to value people in positions of power who are being anti-racist. Because, for instance, if we are being anti-racist and we don't look upon Black and brown kids as intellectually inferior, and we see Black and brown kids not receiving as much resources as, let's say, white kids, we're going to see that as a problem. And then the next step is we're going to start asking people on the school board and politicians and others, why this inequity in resources? So in a way, because we as individuals are being anti-racist, we're going to compel people in positions of power to be anti-racist too, or we'll vote them out.
Let me share with you some of the thoughts that are happening online. Some people are saying that if you are calling out racism, you yourself are racist. I'm sure that's not the first time that you've heard that. What is the difference?
I mean, that's equivalent to saying that a physician who has been trained to diagnose cancer and has utilized a whole bunch of diagnostic tools to be able to clinically diagnose cancer, that when they then go about diagnosing cancer, as a physician did with me, because I had cancer, that somehow they have cancer. No, I think unfortunately we don't first recognize that racism exists, nor do we recognize that there are people who are skilled and trained in identifying and describing and diagnosing, indeed, racism. And so I think that there are people who imagine that racism doesn't exist and that the real racists are those who are essentially speaking about something that doesn't exist. But unfortunately, when we look out at all of the inequities and disparities in our societies, that's proof of racism.
See, Chad says, as he's watching this conversation, are we still going to give power to the media and continue on and on talking about race? It isn't a race issue, in all caps. It's quite humbly an educational matter. The media will continue to split us. Is that blaming the messenger?
Well, I mean, I think that it's actually both. In other words, so there are people who right now believe that, let's say, nations in Africa are disproportionately impoverished because there's something wrong with African people, that nations in Europe are disproportionately wealthier because there's something superior about people in Europe. And they believe that because of the media, because of education, because of what they have been told over the course of their life. And of course, we have to counteract that. We have to make sure that people recognize that Europeans are not indeed superior to Africans.
Anisha Wright sent a question to you just a few hours ago, and she wanted to ask, well, where do we go? What is the point of the work that we do if we are working towards anti-racism? Here she is.
The only thing wrong with Black people is that we think something is wrong with Black people. Dr. Kendi, thank you for your service. That quote was a quote from your book, Stamped from the Beginning, that I used in the 2020 keynote. I do come to you today through the lens of a Black mother who is an educator, raising two joyful, peaceful, brilliant, powerful Black children. When you think about your work in becoming an anti-racist, do you see that as the destination, or do you see that as an indicator towards the path of becoming pro-Black or for Black children in all aspects of the work that we do?
I see it as a way station. I don't necessarily see being anti-racist as the destination. I see it as almost a journey. And what I'm hoping is people move along that path, like as Black people strive to be anti-racist, the more they are anti-racist, the more they will value themselves, the more they will value Black people, the more they will fight for the liberation of Black people, and the more they will fight for the liberation of humankind, knowing that if they liberate humanity, they'll liberate Black people. You know, that is the hope. And indeed, I'm thankful for educators like you, who are on this journey.
I am thinking about where we are in the United States right now. I'm sitting in Washington, D.C., so I'm thinking about the US and how in the past few months, the past year, books have been a battleground. Books with ideas, books about anti-racism, books about being inclusive for all different kinds of children, all different kinds of people. And on the list of banned books, your books pop up quite regularly. In January, Jazeera did this report. I'm just intrigued by the last comment you'll hear in this report. And just bounce off the back of the current atmosphere within which you are working. Let's take a look at the report first of all.
A battle is waging at school boards across the United States.
I'm sure we've got hundreds of people out there that would like to see those books before we burn them.
Books deemed to be sowing division in the classroom by Republican-controlled boards are being reviewed by authorities. Some are being removed from the shelves.
I don't know that any advocate who's been working on tracking or paying attention to the freedom to read can recall a time when the same book was removed or targeted with such vitriol and haste in so many places all over the country at once. And then the involvement of politicians, state legislatures, governors, this is categorically different. This is next level.
It is next level, and indeed, at the same time, it's indicative of other periods in American history. I can remember as the abolitionist movement in the United States started to grow in the 1830s, one of the ways in which enslavers responded to the growth of the abolitionist movement was to ban abolitionist books, was to ban anti-slavery books, was to prevent people in the South from reading about the horrors of slavery, to prevent people from being inspired by abolitionist texts. Indeed, during the Civil Rights Movement, there were efforts to ban books as well. And so unfortunately, recently, as we've sought to make strides towards equity and justice in this country, one of the ways in which there has been a reaction to prevent that, has been the banning of books that in some cases are the source of those drives.
What I find educational and informative about your work is that it's backed up by academic and scholarly work as well. You're not just writing your opinion, not just writing your take as a man of color in America. For instance, if we go to Magnolia Flower, at the back of the book, there's a historical note and there's an author's note. And it's something that Carmen noticed when she wanted to ask you a question about your movement from one part of your work to another part of the work and how it informs the book. Here she is.
Dr. Kendi, in your book, you write about making the shift from doing research for research's sake to actually having your research be used to improve policy. Could you talk a little bit about that transition and shift for you professionally?
Sure. I mean, as an academic, as someone who earned a PhD, in too many cases, we are taught that the audience of our research are other academics, that we're seeking to really advance the field itself and simultaneously advance our careers in the process. But I realized that, at least for me, that wasn't enough, that I wanted to produce what I consider to be public scholarship. And what I mean by public scholarship isn't scholarship that is just known by the public, but scholarship that can literally impact the lives of the public. And in order for scholarship to impact the lives of the general public, it has to be accessible. People have to be able to consume it, regular, everyday folks. And so I'm committed to that type of work.
I'm just looking at some of the events that you've been at, and you've been speaking to people and talking to the public, and they're reading your books and enjoying your work. What is that like to see people in a line waiting to hear you speak? What does that say about you as a professor, a scholar, historian, a girl dad? What does that mean to you?
I mean, I try to focus on on the work. I am certainly honored that people are interested in coming to hear me speak or to read my books. But I'm also honored to be part of a larger community of writers and thinkers and scholars and activists and just everyday human beings who are striving to create a different type of world, for our children, for elderly people, for us all. And so it almost, it certainly is touching, but at the same time, it almost inspires me, to do more. And it also causes me to remember that I'm just part of a larger community. I'm just one scholar, who's just trying to do this work.
Dr. Ibram X Kendi, thank you so much for being on the stream today. We started talking about a children's book that you have written. It's called Magnolia Flower. It's by Zora Neale Hurston with beautiful illustrations by Love is Wise, currently available in all good bookshops. Dr. Ibram X Kendi, thanks for being with us. Thank you for all your comments and thoughts online as well. Appreciate you. I'm Femi OK. I'll see you on next time on the stream. Take care, everybody.